Greenlanding Saga. Saga of the Greenlanders. There was a man named Thorvald, a son of Oswald, Ulf's son, Einar Thora's son. Thorvald and Erik the Red, his son, left Jaderen in Norway on account of manslaughter and went to Iceland. At that time, Iceland was extensively colonized. They first lived at Drangar on Hornstrands, and there Thorvald died. Erik then married Thorhild, the daughter of Jorent and Thorbjork, the ship-chested, who was then married to Thorbjorn of the Haukdala family. Erik then removed from the north and made his home at Eriksstaðir by Vastorn. Erik and Thorhild's son was called Leif. After the killing of Eilf the Foul and dueling Hrafn, Erik was banished from Haukadal and betook himself westward to Breiðafjörð, settling in Eini at Eriksstaðir. He loaned his outer dat boards to Thorgest and could not get these again when he demanded them. This gave rise to broils and battles between himself and Thorgest, as Erik's saga relates. Erik was backed in the dispute by Styr Thorgrimsson, Eyjolf of Sveini, and sons of Brand of Optafirth and Thorbjorn Vilfsson, while the Thorgesters were upheld by the sons of Thord the Yeller and Thorgeir of Hittedal. Erik was declared an outlaw at Thorsnesthing. He thereupon equipped his ship for a voyage in Eriksvag, and when he was ready to sail, Styr and the others accompanied him out beyond the islands. Erik told them that it was his purpose to go in search of that country which Gunnbjorn, son of Ulf the Crow, had seen when he was driven westward across the main at the time when he discovered Gunnbjorn's skerries. He added that he would return to his friends if he should succeed in finding this country. Erik sailed out from the Snæfellsjökull and found the land. He gave the name of Midjökull to his landfall, and this is now called Blacksark. From thence he proceeded southward along the coast in search of habitable land. He passed the first winter at Eriksey near the middle of the eastern settlement, and the following spring he went to Eriksfirth, where he selected a dwelling place. In the summer he visited the western uninhabited country and assigned names to many of the localities. The second winter he remained at Holmar by Hrafnsnipa, and the third summer he sailed northward to Snæfell and all the way into Hrafnsfirth. Then he said he had reached the head of Eriksfirth. He then returned and passed the third winter in Eriksey at the mouth of Eriksfirth. The next summer he sailed to Iceland, landing in Breiðafjörð. He called the country which he had discovered Greenland, because he said people would be attracted thither if the country had a good name. Erik spent the winter in Iceland and the following summer set out to colonize the country. He settled at Brattahlid in Eriksfirth and learned men say that in that same summer in which Erik set out to settle Greenland, 35 ships sailed out of Breiðafjörð and Borgarfirth. 14 of these arrived there safely. Some were driven back, and some were lost forever. This was 15 years before Christianity was legally adopted in Iceland. During the same summer, Bishop Frederick and Thorvald Konradsson went aboard from Iceland. Of those men who accompanied Erik to Greenland, the following took possession of land there: Herjulf, Herjulfsfirth, he dwelt at Herjulfsfirth's Neths; Ketil, Ketilsfirth; Hrafn, Hrafnsfirth; Solvi, Solvedal; Helgi, Thorbrandsson; Optafirth, Thorbjorn Glima; Siglufirth, Einar, Einarsfirth; Hofgrim, Hofgrimsfirth; and Vadnafirthi, Onlog, Onlogsfirth, while some went to the western settlement. Leif the Lucky baptized. After that 16 winters had lapsed from the time when Erik the Red went to colonize Greenland. Leif Erikson sailed out from Greenland to Norway. He arrived in Trondheim in the autumn when King Olaf Tryggvason was come down from the north out of Hålogaland. Leif put into Nidaros with his ship and set out at once to visit the king. King Olaf expanded the faith to him as he did to other heathen men who came to visit him. It proved easy for the king to persuade Leif, and he was accordingly baptized, together with all of his shipmates. Leif remained throughout the winter with the king, by whom he was well entertained. Bjarni goes in quest of Greenland. Heriulf was a son of Bard Heriulfsson. He was a kinsman of Ingolf, the first colonist. Ingolf allotted land to Heriulf between Våg and Reykjanes, and he dwelt at first at Drepstok. Heriulf's wife was named Thorgada, and their son was named Bjarni, who was a most promising man. He formed an inclination for voyaging while he was still young, and he prospered both in property and public esteem. It was his custom to pass his winters alternately abroad and with his father. Bjarni soon became the owner of a trading ship, and during the last winter that he spent in Norway, his father, Heriulf, determined to accompany Erik on his voyage to Greenland, and made his preparations to give up his farm. Upon the ship with Heriulf was a Christian man from the Hebrides, Scotland. He is to have composed the Sea Roller's song, which contains this stave: "Mine adventure to the meek one, monk-hearted searcher, I commit now. He who of heaven's halls doth govern, hold the hawk seat ever over me." Heriulf settled at Heriulf's Ness, and was a most distinguished man. Erik the Red dwelt at Brattahlid, where he was held in the highest esteem, and all men paid him homage. These were Erik's children, Leif, Thorvald, and Thorstein, and a daughter whose name was Freydis. She was wedded to a man named Thorvald, and they dwelt at Gardar, where the episcopal seat now is. She was a very haughty woman, while Thorvald was a man of little force of character, and Freydis had been wedded to him chiefly because of his wealth. At that time the people of Greenland were heathen. Bjarni arrived with his ship at Eira in Iceland in the summer of the same year, in the spring of which his father had sailed. Bjarni was much surprised when he heard the news, and would not discharge his cargo. His shipmates inquired of him what he intended to do, and he replied it was his purpose to keep his custom and make his home for the winter with his father, and I will take this ship to Greenland if you will bear me company. They all replied that they would abide by his decision. Then said Bjarni, "Our voyage must be regarded as foolhardy, seeing that no one of us has ever been in the Greenland Sea." Nevertheless, they put out to sea when they were equipped for the voyage, and sailed for 3 days until the land was hidden by the water. And then the fair wind died out, and north winds arose, and fogs, and they knew not whither they were drifting, and thus it lasted for many days. Then they saw the sun again, and were able to determine the quarters of the heavens. They hoisted sail and sailed that day through before they saw land. They discussed among themselves what land it could be, and Bjarni said that he did not believe that it could be Greenland. They asked whether he wished to sail to this land or not. "It is my counsel," said he, "to sail close to the land." They did so, and soon saw that the land was level and covered with woods, and that there were small hillocks upon it. They left the land on their larboard, and let the sheet turn toward the land. They sailed for 2 days before they saw another land. They asked whether Bjarni thought this was Greenland yet. He replied that he did not think this any more like Greenland than the former, because in Greenland there are said to be many great ice mountains. They soon approached this land and saw that it was flat and wooded country. The fair wind failed them then, and the crew took counsel together and concluded that it would be wise to land there. But Bjarni would not consent to this. They alleged that they were in need of both wood and water. "Ye have no lack of either of these," said Bjarni. Of course, forsooth, which won him blame among his shipmates. He bade them hoist sail, which they did, and turning the prow from the land, they sailed out upon the high seas with southwesterly gales for 3 days. When they saw the third land, this land was high and mountainous, with ice mountains upon it. They asked Bjarni then whether he would land there, and he replied that he was not disposed to do so, because this land does not appear to me to offer any attractions. Nor did they lower their sail, but they held their course off the land and saw that it was an island. They left this land astern and held out to sea with the same fair wind. The wind waxed amain, and Bjarni directed them to reef, and not to sail at a speed unbefitting their ship and rigging. They sailed now for 4 days, and when they saw the fourth land, again they asked Bjarni whether he thought this could be Greenland or not. Bjarni answers, "This is like as Greenland according to what had been reported to me concerning it, and here we will steer to the land." They directed their course thither, and landed in the evening below a cape upon which was a boat, and there upon this cape dwelt Heriulf, Bjarni's father, whence the cape took its name, and was afterwards called Heriulfsness. Bjarni now went to his father, gave up his voyaging, and remained with his father while Heriulf lived, and continued to live there after his father. Here begins the brief history of the Greenlanders. Next to this is now to be told how Bjarni Heriulfsson came out from Greenland on a visit to Earl Erik, by whom he was well received. Bjarni gave an account of his travels upon the occasion when he saw the lands, and the people thought that he had been lacking in enterprise, since he had no report to give concerning these countries, and the fact brought him reproach. Bjarni was appointed one of the Earl's men and went out to Greenland the following summer. There was now much talk about voyages of discovery. Leif, the son of Erik the Red of Brattahlid, visited Bjarni Heriulfsson and bought a ship of him and collected a crew until they formed altogether a company of 35 men. Leif invited his father Erik to become the leader of the expedition, but Erik declined, saying that he was then stricken in years, and adding that he was less able to endure the exposure of sea life than he had been. Leif replied that he would nevertheless be the one who would be the most apt to bring good luck, and Erik yielded to Leif's solicitation and rode from home when they were ready to sail. When he was but a short distance from the ship, the horse which Erik was riding stumbled, and he was thrown from his back and wounded his foot, whereupon he exclaimed, "It is not designed for me to discover more lands than the one which we are now living, nor can we now continue longer together." Erik returned home to Brattahlid, and Leif pursued his way to the ship with his companions, 35 men. One of the company was a German named Tyrker. They put the ship in order, and when they were ready they sailed out to sea, and found first the land which Bjarni and his shipmates found last. They sailed up to the land and cast anchor, and launched a boat and went ashore, and saw no grass there. Great ice mountains lay inland back from the sea, and it was a table of flat land rock all the way from the sea to the ice mountains. The country seemed to them to be entirely devoid of good qualities. Then said Leif, "It has not come to pass with us in regards in this land with Bjarni that we have gone upon it. To this country I will now give a name and call it Helleland." They returned to the ship and put out to sea and found the second land. They sailed again to the land and came to anchor, and launched the boat and went ashore. This was a level wooded land, and there were broad stretches of white sand where they went, and land was level by the sea. Then said Leif, "This land shall have a name after its nature, and we will call it Markland." They returned to the ship forthwith and sailed away upon the main with northeast winds, and were out 2 days before the sighted land. They sailed toward this land and came to an island which lay to the northward off the land. There they went ashore and looked about them, the weather being fine, and they observed that there was dew upon the grass, and so it happened that they touched dew with their hands, and touched the hands to the mouth, and it seemed to them they had never before tasted anything so sweet as this. They went abroad their ship again and sailed into a certain sound, which lay between the island and a cape, which jutted out from the land on the north, and they stood in westering past the cape. At ebb tide there were broad reaches of shallow water there, and they ran their ship aground there, and it was a long distance from the ship to the ocean. Yet were they so anxious to go ashore that they could not wait until the tide should rise under the ship, but hastened to the land where a certain river flows out from a lake. As soon as the tide rose beneath their ship, however, they took the boat and rowed to the ship, which they convened up the river, and so into the lake, where they cast anchor and carried their hammocks ashore from the ship, and built themselves booths there. They afterwards determined to establish themselves there for the winter, and accordingly built a large house. There was no lack of salmon there either, in the river or in the lake, and larger salmon than they had ever seen before. The country thereabouts seemed to be possessed of such good qualities that cattle would need no fodder there during the winters. There was no frost there in the winters, and the grass withered but little. The days and nights there were of more nearly equal length than in Greenland or Iceland. On the shortest day of winter the sun was up between Ekestad and Dagmalastad. When they had completed their house, Leif said to his companions, "I propose now to divide our company into 2 groups, and to set about an exploration of the country. 1/2 of our party shall remain at home at the house, while the other half shall investigate the land, and they must not go beyond a point for which they cannot return that same evening, and are not to separate from each other." Thus they did for a time. Leif himself by turns joined the exploring party or remained behind at the house. Leif was a large and powerful man, and of most imposing bearing, a man of sagacity, and a very just man in all things. Leif the Lucky finds men upon a skerry at sea. It was discovered one evening that one of their company was missing, and this proved to be Tyrker the German. Leif was sorely troubled by this, for Tyrker had lived with Leif and his father for a long time, and had been very devoted to Leif when he was a child. Leif severely reprimanded his companions and prepared to go in search of him, taking 12 men with him. They had proceeded but a short distance from the house when they were met by Tyrker, whom they received most cordially. Leif observed at once that his foster father was in lively spirits. Tyrker had a prominent forehead, restless eyes, small features, was diminutive in stature, and rather a sorry-looking individual, but was nonetheless a most capable handicraftsman. Leif addressed him and asked, "Wherefore art thou so belated, foster father mine, and astray from the others?" In the beginning Tyrker spoke for some time in German, rolling his eyes and grinning, and they could not understand him, but after a time he addressed them in the northern tongue. "I did not go much further than you, and yet I have something of novelty to relate. I have found vines and grapes." "Is this indeed true, foster father?" said Leif. "Of a certainty it is true, for I was born there where there is no lack of either grapes or vines." They slept the night through, and on the morrow Leif said to his shipmates, "We will now divide our labors, and each day we'll either gather grapes or cut vines and fell trees so as to obtain a cargo of these for my ship." They acted upon this advice, and it is said that their afterboat was filled with grapes. A cargo sufficient for the ship was cut, and when the spring came they made their ship ready and sailed away, and from its products Leif gave the land a name and called it Wineland. They sailed out to sea and had fair winds until they sighted Greenland and the fells below the glacier. Then one of the men spoke up and said, "Why do you steer the ship so much into the wind?" Leif answers, "I have my mind upon my steering, but no other matters as well. Do you not see anything out of the common?" They replied that they saw nothing strange. "I do not know," says Leif, "whether it is a ship or a skerry that I see." Now they saw it and said that it must be a skerry, but he was so much keener of sight than they that he was able to discern men upon the skerry. "I think it best to tack," says Leif, "so that we may draw near to them, that we may be able to render them assistance if they should stand in need of it, and if they should not be placeably disposed, we shall still have better command of the situation than they." They approached the skerry and, lowering their sail, cast anchor and launched a second small boat which they had brought with them. Tyrke inquired who was the leader of the party. He replied that his name was Thori and that he was a Norseman. "But why is thy name?" Leif gave his name. "Art thou a son of Erik the Red of Brattahlid?" says he. Leif responded that he was. "It is now my wish," says Leif, "to take you all in my ship, and likewise so much of your possessions as the ship will hold." This offer was accepted, and with their ship thus laden they held away to Eriksfirth, and sailed until they arrived at Brattahlid. Having discharged the cargo, Leif invited Thori with his wife Gudrid and 3 others to make their home with him, and procured quarters for the other members of the crew, both for his own and Thori's men. Leif rescued 15 persons from that skerry. He was afterward called Leif the Lucky. Leif had now goodly store both of property and honor. There was serious illness that winter in Thori's party, and Thori and a great number of his people died. Erik the Red also died that winter. There was now much talk about Leif's Wineland journey, and his brother Thorvald held that the country had not been sufficiently explored. Thereupon Leif said to Thorvald, "If it be thy will, brother, thou mayest go to Wineland with my ship, but I wish the ship first to fetch the wood with which Thori had upon the skerry," and so it was done. Thorvald goes to Wineland. Now Thorvald, with the advice of his brother Leif, prepared to make this voyage with 30 men. They put their ship in order and sailed out to sea, and there is no account of their voyage before their arrival at Leif's booth in Wineland. They laid up their ship there and remained there quietly during the winter, supplying themselves with food by fishing. In the spring, however, Thorvald said that they should put their ship in order, and that a few men should take the afterboat and proceed along the western coast and explore the region thereabouts during the summer. They found it a fair, well-wooded country. It was but a short distance from the woods to the sea, and there were white sands, as well as great numbers of islands and shallows. They found neither dwelling of man nor lair of beast, but in one of the westerly islands they found a wooden building for the shelter of grain. They found no other trace of human handiwork, and they turned back, and arrived at Leif's booth in the autumn. The following summer Thorvald set out toward the east with the ship, and along the northern coast. They were met by a high wind off a certain promontory, and were driven ashore there, and damaged the keel of their ship, and were compelled to remain there for a long time and repair the injury to their vessel. Then said Thorvald to his companions, "I propose that we raise the keel upon this cape and call it Keelness," and so they did. Then they sailed away to the eastward off the land and into the mouth of the adjoining firth, and to a headland which projected into the sea there, and which was entirely covered with woods. They found an anchorage for their ship and put out the gangway to the land, and Thorvald and all his companions went ashore. "It is a fair region here," said he, "and here I should like to make my home." They then returned to the ship and discovered on the sands and beyond the headland 3 mounds. They went up to these and saw that they were 3 skin canoes, with 3 men under each. They thereupon divided their party and succeeded in seizing all of the men but one, who escaped with his canoe. They killed the 8 men and then ascended the headland again and looked about them, and discovered within the firth certain hillocks, which they concluded must be habitations. They were then so overpowered with sleep that they could not keep awake, and all fell into a heavy slumber, from which they were awakened by the sound of a cry uttered above them. And the words of the cry were these: "Awake, Thorvald, thou and all thy company, if thou wouldst save thy life, and board thy ship with all thy men, and sail with all speed from the land." A countless number of skin canoes then advanced toward them from the inner part of the firth, whereupon Thorvald exclaimed, "We must put out the war boards and both sides of the ship, and defend ourselves to the best of our ability, but offer little attack." This they did, and the Skraelings, after they had shot at them for a time, fled precipitously, each as best he could. Thorvald then inquired of his men whether any of them had been wounded, and they informed him that no one of them had received a wound. "I have been wounded in my armpit," says he. "An arrow flew in between the gunwale and the shield below my arm. Here is the shaft, and it will bring me to my end. I counsel you now to retrace your way with the utmost speed, but me I shall convene to the headland, which seemed to me oft a pleasant dwelling place. Thus it may be fulfilled that the truth sprang to my lips when I expressed the wish to abide there for a time. Ye shall bury me there, and place a cross at my head, and another at my feet, and call it Cross Ness for ever after." At that time Christianity had obtained in Greenland. Erik the Red died, however, before the introduction of Christianity. Thorvald died, and when they had carried out his injunctions, they took their departure and rejoined their companions, and they told each other of the experiences which had befallen them. They remained there during the winter and gathered grapes and wood with which to freight the ship. In the following spring they returned to Greenland and arrived with their ship in Erik's Firth, where they were able to recount great tidings to Leif. Thorstein Erikson dies in the western settlement. In the meantime it had come to pass in Greenland that Thorstein of Erik's Firth had married and taken to wife Gudrid, Thorbjorn's daughter, she who had been the spouse of Thori Eastman, as had been already related. Now Thorstein Erikson, being minded to make the voyage to Wineland after the body of his brother Thorvald, equipped the same ship, and selected a crew of 25 men of good size and strength, and taking with him his wife Gudrid, when all was in readiness, they sailed out into the open ocean, and out of sight of land. They were driven hither and thither all over the sea that summer, and lost all reckoning, and at the end of the first week of the winter they made land at Lisefirth in Greenland, in the western settlement. Thorstein set out in search of quarters for his crew and succeeded in procuring homes for all his shipmates, but he and his wife were unprovided for, and remained together upon the ship for 2 or more days. At this time Christianity was still in its infancy in Greenland. It befell early one morning that men came to the tent, and the leader inquired who the people were within the tent. Thorstein replies, "We are twain," says he, "but who is it who asks?" "My name is Thorstein, and I am known as Thorstein the Swarthy, and my errand here is to offer you 2, husband and wife, a home with me." Thorstein replied that he would consult with his wife, and she bidding him decide, he accepted the invitation. "I will come after you on the morrow with the sumpter horse, for I am not lacking in means wherewith to provide for you both, although it will be lonely living with me, since there are but 2 of us, my wife and myself, for I forsooth am a very hard man to get on with. Moreover, my faith is not the same as yours, albeit methinks it is better to which you hold." He returned for them on the morrow with the beast, and they took up their home with Thorstein the Swarthy, and were well treated by him. Gudrid was a woman of fine presence, and a clever woman, and very happy in adapting herself to strangers. Early in the winter, Thorstein Erikson's party was visited by sickness, and many of his companions died. He caused coffins to be made for the bodies of the dead, and had them conveyed to the ship and bestowed there, for it is my purpose to have all the bodies taken to Eriksfirth in the summer. It was not long before illness appeared in Thorstein's home, and his wife, whose name was Grimhild, was first taken sick. She was a very vigorous woman, and as strong as a man, but the sickness mastered her, and soon thereafter Thorstein Eriksson was seized with the illness, and they both lay ill at the same time. And Grimhild, Thorstein the Swarthy's wife, died, and when she was dead, Thorstein went out of the room to procure a deal upon which to lay the corpse. Thereupon Gudrid spoke. "Do not be absent long, Thorstein mine," says she. He replied so that it should be. Thorstein Eriksson then exclaimed, "Our housewife is acting now in a marvelous fashion, for she is raising herself upon her elbow and stretching out her feet from the side of the bed and groping after her shoes." At that moment Thorstein, the master of the house, entered, and Grimhild laid herself down, wherewithal every timber in the room creaked. Thorstein now fashioned a coffin for Grimhild's body and bore it away and cared for it. He was a big man and strong, but it called for all of his strength to enable him to remove the corpse from the house. The illness grew upon Thorstein Eriksson, and he died, whereat his wife Gudrid was sorely grieved. They were all in the room at the time, and Gudrid was seated upon a chair before the bench upon which her husband Thorstein was lying. Thorstein, the master of the house, then taking Gudrid in his arms, carried her from the chair and seated himself with her upon another bench, over against her husband's body, and exerted himself in divers way to console her, and endeavored to reassure her, and promised her that he would accompany her to Eriksfirth with the body of her husband, Thorstein, and those of his companions. "I will likewise summon other persons hither," says he, "to attend upon thee and entertain thee." She thanked him. Then Thorstein Eriksson sat up and exclaimed, "Where is Gudrid?" Thrice he repeated the question, but Gudrid made no response. She then asked Thorstein the master, "Shall I give answer to his question or not?" Thorstein the master bade her make no reply, and he then crossed the floor and seated himself upon the chair, with Gudrid in his lap, and spoke, saying, "What dost thou wish, namesake?" After a little while Thorstein replied, "I desire to tell Gudrid of the fate which is in store for her, to the end that she may be better reconciled to my death, for I am indeed come to a goodly resting place. This I have to tell thee, Gudrid, that thou art to marry an Icelander, that ye are to have a long wedded life together, in a numerous and noble progeny, illustrious and famous, of good odour and sweet virtues. Ye shall go from Greenland to Norway, and then to Iceland, where ye shall build your home. There ye shall dwell together for a long time, but thou shalt outlive him, and shalt then go abroad and to the south, and shalt return to Iceland again to thy home, and there a church shall be raised, and thou shalt abide there and take the veil, and there thou shalt die." When he had thus spoken, Thorstein sank back again, and his body was laid out for burial, and borne to the ship. Thorstein the master faithfully performed all his promises to Gudrid. He sold his lands and livestock in the spring, and accompanied Gudrid with the ship and all the possessions. He put ship in order, procured a crew, and then sailed to Eriksfirth. The bodies of the dead were now buried at the church, and Gudrid then went home to Leif at Brattahlid, while Thorstein the Swarthy made a home for himself on Eriksfirth, and remained there as long as he lived, and was looked upon as a very superior man. remained there as long as he lived and was looked upon as a very superior man. Of the Wineland voyages of Thorfinn and his companions. That summer a ship came from Norway to Greenland. The skipper's name was Thorfinn Karlsefni. He was a son of Thord Horsehead and a grandson of Snorri, the son of Thord of Hofdi. Thorfinn Karlsefni, who was a very wealthy man, passed the winter at Brattahlid with Leif Erikson. He very soon set his heart upon Gudrid and sought her hand in marriage. She referred him to Leif for her answer and was subsequently betrothed to him, and their marriage was celebrated that same winter. A renewed discussion arose concerning a Wineland voyage, and the folk urged Karlsefni to make the venture, Gudrid joining with the others. He determined to undertake the voyage and assembled a company of 60 men and 5 women and entered into an agreement with his shipmates that they should each share equally in all the spoils of the enterprise. They took with them all kinds of cattle, as it was their intention to settle the country if they could. Karlsefni asked Leif for the house in Wineland, and he replied that he would lend it but not give it. They sailed out to sea with the ship and arrived safe and sound at Leif's booths and carried their hammocks ashore there. They were soon provided with an abundant and goodly supply of food, for a whale of good size and quality was driven ashore there, and they secured it and flensed it and had then no lack of provisions. The cattle were turned out upon the land, and the males soon became very restless and vicious. They had brought a bull with them. Karlsefni caused trees to be felled and to be hewed into timbers, therewith to load his ship, and the wood was placed upon a cliff to dry. They gathered somewhat of all of the valuable products of the lands, grapes and all kinds of game and fish and other good things. In the summer succeeding the first winter, skraelings were discovered. A great troop of men came forth from out of the woods. The cattle were hard by, and the bull began to bellow and roar with a great noise, whereat the skraelings were frightened and ran away, with their packs wherein were grey furs, sables, and all kinds of peltries. They fled towards Karlsefni's dwelling and sought to effect an entrance into the house, but Karlsefni caused the doors to be defended against them. Neither people could understand the other's language. The skraelings put down the bundles then and loosed them and offered their wares for barter, and were especially anxious to exchange these for weapons. Karlsefni forbade his men to sell their weapons, and taking counsel with himself, he bade the women carry out milk to the skraelings, which they no sooner saw than they wanted to buy it and nothing else. Now the outcome of the skraelings' trading was that they carried their wares away in their stomachs, while they left their packs and peltries behind with Karlsefni and his companions, and having accomplished this exchange, they went away. Now it is to be told that Karlsefni caused a strong wooden palisade to be constructed and set around the house. It was at this time that Gudrid, Karlsefni's wife, gave birth to a male child, and the boy was called Snorri. In the early part of the second winter, the skraelings came to them again, and these were now much more numerous than before, and brought with them the same wares as the first. Then said Karlsefni to the woman, "Do ye carry out now the same food, which proves to be so profitable before, and not else?" When they saw this, they cast their packs in over the palisade. Gudrid was sitting within in the doorway, beside the cradle of her infant son Snorri, when a shadow fell upon the door, and a woman in a black namkirtle entered. She was short in stature, and wore a fillet about her head. Her hair was of a light chestnut color, and she was pale of hue, and so big-eyed that never before had eyes so large been seen in a human skull. She went up to where Gudrid was seated and said, "What is thy name?" "My name is Gudrid. What is thy name?" "My name is Gudrid," said she. The housewife Gudrid motioned her with her hand to a seat beside her. But it so happened that at that very instant Gudrid heard a great crash, whereupon the woman vanished, and at that same moment one of the Skraelings, who had tried to seize their weapons, was killed by one of Karlsefni's followers. At this the Skraelings fled fast, leaving their garments and wares behind them, and not a soul save Gudrid alone beheld this woman. Now we must needs take counsel together, says Karlsefni, for that I believe they will visit us a third time in great numbers and attack us. Let us now adopt this plan. 10 of our number shall go out upon the cape and show themselves there, while the remainder of our company shall go into the woods and hew a clearing for our cattle. When the troop approaches from the forest, we will also take our bull, let him go in advance of us. The lie of the land was such that the proposed meeting place had the lake upon the one side and the forest upon the other. Karlsefni's advice was now carried into execution. The Skraelings advanced to the spot which Karlsefni had selected for the encounter, and a battle was fought there, in which great numbers of the band of the Skraelings were slain. There was one man among the Skraelings of large size and fine bearing, whom Karlsefni concluded must be their chief. One of the Skraelings picked up an axe, and having looked at it for a time, he brandished it about one of his companions and hewed at him, and on that instant the man fell dead. Thereupon the big man seized the axe, and after examining it for a moment, he hurled it as far as he could out into the sea. Then they fled helter-skelter into the woods, and thus their intercourse came to an end. Karlsefni and his party remained there throughout the winter, but in the spring Karlsefni announces that he is not minded to remain there longer, but will return to Greenland. They now made ready for the voyage, and carried away with them much booty in vines and grapes and peltries. They sailed out upon the high sea, brought their ships safely to Eriksfirth, where they remained during the winter. Freydis causes the brothers to be put to death. There was now much talk anew about a Wineland voyage, for this was reckoned both a profitable and an honourable enterprise. The same summer that Karlsefni arrived from Wineland, a ship from Norway arrived in Greenland. The ship was commanded by 2 brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, who passed the winter in Greenland. They were descended from an Icelandic family of the Eastfirths. It is now to be added that Freydis, Erik's daughter, set out from her home at Garda and waited upon the brothers Helgi and Finnbogi, and invited them to sail with their vessel to Wineland, to share with her equally all of the good things which they might succeed in obtaining there. To this they agreed, and she departed thence to visit her brother Leif, and ask him to give her the house which she had caused to be erected in Wineland, but he made her the same answer as that which he had given Karlsefni, saying that he would lend the house but not give it. It was stipulated between Karlsefni and Freydis that each should have on shipboard 30 able-bodied men besides the women, but Freydis immediately violated this compact by concealing 5 men more than this number, and this the brothers did not discover before they arrived in Wineland. They now put out to sea, having agreed beforehand that they should sail in company, if possible, and although they were not far apart from each other, the brothers arrived somewhat in advance, and carried their belongings up to Leif's house. Now when Freydis arrived, her ship was discharged, and the baggage carried up to the house, whereupon Freydis exclaimed, "Why do you carry your baggage in here? Since we believed," said they, "that all promises made to us must be kept. It was to me that Leif loaned the house," says she, "not you." Whereupon Helgi exclaimed, "We brothers cannot hope to rival thee in wrong-dealing." They thereupon carried their baggage forth and built a hut above the sea on the bank of the lake, and put all in order about it, while Freydis caused wood to be felled, with which to load her ship. The winter now set in, and the brothers suggested that they should amuse themselves by playing games. This they did for a time until the folk began to disagree, when dissensions arose between them, and the games came to an end, and the visits between the houses ceased, and thus it continued far into the winter. One morning early, Freydis arose from her bed and dressed herself, but did not put on her shoes and stockings. A heavy dew had fallen, and she took her husband's cloak and wrapped it about her, and then walked to the brothers' house and up to the door, which had been only partly closed by one of them, who had gone out a short time before. She pushed the door open and stood silently in the doorway for a time. Finnbogi, who was lying on the innermost side of the room, was awake and said, "What dost thou wish here, Freydis?" She answers, "I wish thee to rise and go out with me, for I would speak with thee." He did so, and they walked to a tree which lay close by the wall of the house and seated themselves upon it. "How art thou pleased here?" says she. He answers, "I am well pleased with the fruitfulness of the land, but I am ill content with the breach which has come between us, for methinks there has been no cause for it." "It is even as thou sayest," says she, "and thus it seems to me. But my errand to thee is that I wish to exchange ships with you brothers, for that ye have a larger ship than I, and I wish to depart from here." "To this I must accede," says he, "if it is thy pleasure." Therewith they parted, and she returned home, and Finnbogi to his bed. She climbed up into bed and awakened Thorvald with her cold feet, and he asked her why she was so cold and wet. She answered with great passion, "I have been to the brothers," says she, "to try to buy their ship, for I wish to have a larger vessel. But they received my overtures so ill that they struck me and handled me very roughly. What time thou, poor wretch, will neither avenge my shame nor thy own, and I find perforce that I no longer in Greenland. Moreover, I shall part from thee unless you wreak vengeance for this." And now he could not stand her taunts no longer, and ordered the men to rise at once and took their weapons. And this they did, and they then proceeded directly to the house of the brothers and entered it, while the folk were asleep, and seized and bound them, and led each one out. When he was bound, as they came out, Freydis caused each one to be slain. In this wise all of the men were put to death, and only the women were left, and these no one would kill. At this Freydis exclaimed, "Hand me an axe." This was done, and she fell upon the 5 women, and left them all dead. They returned home after this dreadful deed, and it was very evident that Freydis was well content with her work. She addressed her companions, saying, "If it be ordained for us to come again to Greenland, I shall contrive the death of any man who shall speak of these events. We must give it out that we left them living here when we came away." Early in the spring they equipped the ship, which had belonged to the brothers, and freighted it all with products of the land, which they could obtain, and which the ship would carry. Then they put out to sea, and after a prosperous voyage arrived with their ship in Eriksfirth early in the summer. Karlsefni was there with his ship all ready to sail, and was awaiting a fair wind, and people say that a ship richer laden than which was commanded had never left Greenland. Concerning Freydis. Freydis now went to her home, since it had remained unharmed during her absence. She bestowed liberal gifts upon all of her companions, for she was anxious to screen her guilt. She now established herself at her home, but her companions were not all so closed-mouthed concerning their misdeeds and wickedness that rumors did not get abroad at last. These finally reached her brother Leif, and he thought it a most shameful story. He thereupon took 3 of the men who had been of Freydis's party, and forced them all at the same time to a confession of the affair, and their stories entirely agreed. "I have no heart," says Leif, "to punish my sister, Freydis, as she deserves, but this I predict of them, that there is little prosperity in store for their offspring." Hence it came to pass that no one from the time forward thought them worthy of aught but evil. It now remains to take up the story from the time when Karlsefni made his ship ready and sailed out to sea. He had a successful voyage and arrived in Norway safe and sound. He remained there during the winter and sold his wares, and both he and his wife were received with great favor by the most distinguished men of Norway. The following spring he put his ship in order for the voyage to Iceland, and when all his preparations had been made and his ship was lying at the wharf awaiting favorable winds, there came to him a southerner, a native of Bremen in the Saxon land, who wished to buy his house neat. "I do not wish to sell it," says he. "I will give thee half a mark in gold for it," says the southerner. This Karlsefni thought a good offer, and accordingly closed the bargain. The southerner went his way with the house neat, and Karlsefni knew not what mood it was, but it was Monsieur come from Wineland. Karlsefni sailed away and arrived with his ship in the north of Iceland, in Skagafirth. His vessel was beached there during the winter, and in the spring he bought Glaumbar land and made his home there, and dwelt there as long as he lived, and was a man of greatest prominence. From him and his wife Gudrid, a numerous and goodly lineage descended. After Karlsefni's death, Gudrid, together with her son Snorri, who was born in Wineland, took charge of the farmstead, and when Snorri married, Gudrid went abroad and made a pilgrimage to the south, after which she returned again to the home of her son Snorri, who had caused a church to be built at Glaumbar. Gudrid then took the veil and became an anchorite and lived there the rest of her days. Snorri had a son named Thorgeir, who was the father of Ingveld, the mother of Bishop Brand. Hallfrid was the name of the daughter of Snorri, Karlsefni's son. She was the mother of Runolf, Bishop Thorlak's father. Bjorn was the name of another son of Karlsefni and Gudrid. He was the father of Thorun, the mother of Bishop Bjorn. Many men are descended from Karlsefni, and he has been blessed with a numerous and famous posterity, and of all men Karlsefni has given the most exact accounts of all these voyages, of which something has now been recounted.